Peter Credlin, live on Sky News Australia.
Good evening, welcome to the show. Great to have your company. Here's what's coming up on Credlin. For all the talk from Jim Chalmers that his budget is inflation busting, it would appear that the experts disagree. One bank even going as far as to put a 50-50 odds on for a recession this year. More concern too from the Reserve Bank over inflation that keeps a rate hike on the table. Less than a week until there's an international vote on a new pandemic treaty to hand the World Health Organisation great powers that could impact Australia's sovereignty. Senator Alex Antic on the show tonight to explain why you need to understand exactly what's in this proposed treaty. Plus, the Prime Minister again in the spotlight over his failure to reject the International Criminal Court's moral equivalence between Israel and Hamas, as Peter Dutton says he would consider withdrawing Australia from the ICC if elected. Special seats in the Parliament for Indigenous MPs only and billions of dollars in reparations. A Victorian Labor minister, well, she's let the cat out of the bag as to what's on the table in the state's treaty negotiations. And more proof that Andrew Giles' soft touch to immigration detention is putting Australians at risk with a ministerial directive central to the release of a detainee now accused of murder. Now, at what point does the Prime Minister put the interests of our safety first and sack his mate for repeated incompetence?
What we're seeing is the Minister not taking the necessary action that he should be taking to keep the Australian community safe.
We will stay with that story. More evidence today of poor judgment and incompetence from Immigration Minister Andrew Giles. This is the minister who should have anticipated the impending High Court judgment, releasing a foreign criminal into the community, but he did not. And then he released some 150 of them, not just the one that the court demanded, including murderers, rapists and child sex offenders. And, as subsequently now it seems, not once used the legislation he demanded the Parliament pass in a rush last year to seek preventative detention orders to lock some of these people up again. Today it's reported a directive from this minister caused a tribunal to release from detention a particular foreign criminal who then allegedly murdered a man on Mother's Day. The Sudanese-born man, who's just been charged with a stabbing murder, had a long criminal history of more than 40 offences, including actual bodily harm against his partner. He'd also been convicted of threatening to kill, possessing a knife and running down with a car. In cancelling a ministerial order revoking his visa and thus releasing him into the community, the Administrative Appeals Tribunal cited a directive from Minister Giles that foreigners who'd spent most of their lives here in Australia should be given special consideration. The minister accepted, said the tribunal, quote, "The considerable weight should be given to the fact that the applicant had been ordinarily resident in Australia since his formative years, and accepted that this primary consideration weighs in the applicant's favour." Now, this directive, known as Direction 99 from Minister Giles, was prompted by a recent visit from the New Zealand Prime Minister and complaints from them about Australia's practice under Peter Dutton of deporting back to New Zealand Kiwis who'd committed serious crimes here. Not only did Giles issue the direction that the tribunal used to free this alleged murderer, but he failed then to overturn the tribunal's decision, which he reportedly had the power to do had he had the guts to do it. A man now is dead, allegedly as a result. Now, I accept no one's perfect. Not even the best ministers get it right all of the time. They often can make a mistake. But this bloke, he's a repeat offender. And his mistakes, unlike a wrong number in a budget column, have potentially caused material harm. Right now, given all of his mistakes on the issue of these foreign criminals, you think Giles and his office would be maximising community protection and minimising these concessions to the refugee lobby. Instead, as this direction shows, community safety, well, it's just not his priority. The fact that he's still in the job, still the Minister for Immigration, This is now a reflection on the Prime Minister himself, and just another sign that it's not the Minister for Immigration alone who's out of his depth. Look, the Voice referendum might have bombed disastrously last year, and thank God for that. But left activists have never let democracy interfere with their plans to change our country. Victoria has had a so-called First Peoples Assembly since 2019, tasked with negotiating a treaty between 45,000 Victorians who identify as Aboriginal and the Parliament, representing all 6 million Victorians. Even though, mind you, turnout was just 10% at last year's election for this First Peoples Assembly. Naturally, Victorian Labor, well, they're pushing on despite the state's rejection of the separatist Uluru agenda. Voice, Treaty and Truth that Victorians voted down by 55% to 45%. Yesterday, the Victorian government's so-called Treaty and First Peoples Minister refused to rule out anything in an appearance before a parliamentary committee. The Minister, Natalie Hutchins, refused to rule out giving compulsory acquired private property to Indigenous groups. She refused to rule out separate Indigenous seats in the Victorian State Parliament. She refused to rule out billions of dollars in reparations. You see, as far as this minister and the Victorian government is concerned, the creation of the state of Victoria was a fundamentally unjust act, an illegitimate invasion which now needs to be atoned for. Not the best thing that ever happened here to all of us, Indigenous, early settlers and recent migrants alike, something that we should celebrate. And sure, Aboriginal culture has changed more over the past 2 centuries than in the previous 60,000 years. But as Jacinta Nampijinpa-Price has often said, that's largely a good thing because it's given Aboriginal people access to the human rights, scientific progress and gender equality that were previously unknown. As with the National Voice, this First Peoples Assembly in Victoria will be yet another grievance monger, playing on the guilt of generations that have done no collective wrong to the benefit of generations that have suffered no specific harm. The travesty here is that Victorian Labor is insisting on this treaty without the need for a special state referendum, because it's always been presumed that if asked, even Victorians would say no. And believe me, if Labor gets this up in Victoria, it will soon come to a state near you. Trudy McIntosh now in Canberra with our headlines.
There are growing calls for Australia to consider withdrawing from the International Criminal Court.
The opposition leader says it should be on the table if criminal warrants for Israeli leaders proceed.
I don't rule it out, but I think the pressure at the moment needs to be for like-minded countries that share our values to stand shoulder to shoulder.
The Prime Minister kept a low profile today after refusing to back in Joe Biden's condemnation of the ICC yesterday.
Well, I don't comment on court processes in Australia, let alone court processes globally.
But only minutes later, breaking his own rule, weighing in on the Julian Assange case.
Enough is enough. There's nothing to be served by the ongoing incarceration of Mr Assange.
Our Prime Minister got it wrong yesterday, and the opportunity for him is to stop digging.
The government is under pressure to explain why a former immigration detainee, now charged with murder in Queensland, was released earlier this year.
Born in Sudan, Emmanuel Saki came to Australia as a child. His visa was cancelled in 2019 before being reinstated this March, despite an extensive criminal record. The Administrative Appeals Tribunal deemed he had a low risk of offending and he was released from detention. Just weeks later, he's now facing a murder charge. The opposition argues the Immigration Minister contributed to the man's release after issuing a ministerial direction last year that stated time in Australia should be factored into decisions.
This person would have stayed in the position of having their visa cancelled if the old rules had have applied.
A spokesperson for Andrew Giles says his thoughts are with the victim's family and that the Minister is seeking urgent advice regarding this individual. Trudy McIntosh, Sky News, Canberra.
I might say too, Andrew Giles didn't front the camera. That is his usual take. when these things happen, and I think that's an indictment on him as a minister. Let's get into the headlines now. Sky News host, National Affairs Editor, The Daily Telegraph, James Morrow. Sky News senior reporter, Carolyn Marcus. I'll come back to that detention issue, but James, I want to get into the budget. Mixed reaction, of course, last week. We've seen polls this week that Australians aren't happy. Some of those numbers are the highest recorded against the budget since the polls began. But now you've got the experts saying that things are looking grim. The RBA says it's increasingly difficult to tame inflation without tipping the economy into recession. That's a worry. The Australian Shareholders Association at a conference in Melbourne this week made reference to extremely high levels of government spending. And today, the Macquarie Bank economists, they are warning there's a 50% chance we'll end up in a recession this year thanks to the trap of high migration and high interest rates. So despite the spin, I tell you what, James, I reckon there's tough times ahead, isn't there?
Well, yeah, and, you know, the inflation fight here becomes all the more complicated because so much of the activity in the economy that's creating the consumption and the demand and the stuff that is making the RBA say, oh, look, we've got to, you know, keep an eye on those rates because it's looking inflationary, that's artificial stuff. That's the migration. It's not productivity. It's not because we're actually doing or creating more as a nation. So it's all artificial. So the RBA has to cope with that, plus the fact that, you know, in July, all of our pay packages are going to have more money into them as a result of those stage 3 tax cuts, which, again, that's going to be inflationary. If you tip it into recession, well, then the RBA may have to cut rates, but that's not the way you want to get a rate cut, is it? Because you've wound up mismanaging the economy and flooding it with more money, more government spending, some of the highest on record. You know, that did not come down in the budget. It's like 26% of spending now, of the GDP now, that's spending. And, of course, migration. So this is a terrible situation that the government is in, and it's all the more reason, too, Peter, why I suspect personally they're going to go sooner rather than later on that election.
Yes, I think you're right. I'll get to that too, because there's some interesting spending out on government advertising that I think points to exactly that point you're making there, James. Let's go to that detainee debacle. I opened the show with it tonight. Caroline, and of course we've gone through the issue with the man born in Sudan now accused of murder, charged with murder, and the weight applied by the Admin Appeals Tribunal to a direction from Andrew Giles as minister. We also learn a man from Burundi, he has also walked free from court despite a string of curfew and monitoring breaches. I mean, this is extraordinary. I don't reckon there's a day that goes by where Andrew Giles is in the headlines for all the wrong reasons.
Yeah, these promises to keep us safe by the government and the minister just get more and more laughable with each day that passes. There seems to be a new story every day, as you point out. The most recent one involving this Burundi man, well, he was fined and slapped on the wrist by this court. He'd been convicted on 6 counts of breaching his curfew and failing to maintain his electronic monitoring device. Remember those measures that the government said were going to keep us safe after all those detainees were released? Yeah, well, it doesn't seem to mean very much even when you break those conditions. In his case, the judge could have gave him a 1-year sentence for each of those counts, which means if they had been applied consecutively, he would have served 6 years. But instead, he got a suspended sentence, which means he essentially walks free, and only if he reoffends yet again will he serve any jail time. But the most scandalous part of this, Peter, is that the prosecutor for the Commonwealth did not even provide a position on sentencing, which essentially means that they didn't oppose any kind of suspended sentence or the fact that this person could be released. And all of this obviously follows the other scandal you mentioned involving the other African detainee who'd been released, and the court decided that he was the tribunal decided he was at low risk of reoffending, and then now he's of course been charged with murder. And of course it also follows the case of another detainee who has now been charged with bashing a Perth grandmother after his release. So it does seem endless, and I think every Australian has the right to question whether we really are safe under this current government.
And I say to people at home, I mean, ask yourself, would John Howard or Tony Abbott still have this minister after 12 months plus of failure, and immigration too, record high numbers there, would they still have him in the job? No, they would not. So what does it say about Anthony Albanese? James, I said I'd get into some ad campaign detail. This is, of course, funded by taxpayers. $170 million we learn that Labor's about to spend on advertising. Look at this breakdown. $40 million, well, we know that already. That's those stage 3 tax cuts. $10 million to make us all aware about these new vehicle efficiency standards. $10 million to spruik net zero. $45 million to spruik the government's Future Made in Australia push. And this is how I look at it. You know, we're all going to get these tax cuts. You don't have to apply for them. So why do we need to advertise them? This net zero money, well, that's for something that's 15 years away, so why advertise it now? This, to me, James, is political advertising, absolutely blatant political advertising. And I tell you what it's about. Labor's getting eaten alive by the Greens. 13% they were up there on News Poll on Monday. That says to me they're using the taxpayers' money to spruik this Green agenda and claw back some of that vote that's slipping off further to the left. That's what this is about.
Oh, it's absolutely about that, Peter. And I'll tell you what, it's just wild here in Sydney. When I'm driving to work in the morning, you know, the radio's on, and every other ad, it feels like sometimes, is, you know, we've got a tax cut coming for every Australian, or, you know, we've got new efficiency standards to give you more choice and save you money. Now, these are all the spin things, especially on the car efficiency issue, just that the government wants to get out there. But this is completely campaign advertising. Again, this is all setting us up, again, not only to fight that left flank, those Greens, as you very correctly put it, Peter, but also, you know, getting everybody ready, softened up, trying to make them feel good about, A, this government, and B, their status. Because, you know, at the moment, people don't feel particularly great about where they are, I think, in Australia. Just generally, there's a lot of upset in the community, and this is all pushing that messaging, I think, very much uphill. It's very cynical, and just for the record, I reported, you know, months ago that Treasury was advertising and ramping up, you know, millions of dollars worth of new positions internally and externally to get the sales campaign moving on the stage 3 tax cuts. And at the time I said, why do you need an ad campaign? Everybody gets the taxes. They had no answer.
Correct. Caroline, I know we've been running a lot about these university protests, but you've got well, I wouldn't say it's bad taste, but it's worse than that. A story about a Hamas-themed birthday party. It's gone online. What can you tell us?
Well, Peter, we know children's parties these days, they're getting more and more over the top. I myself am not immune to that. As a mum, I've been known to go a little overboard, but this latest party really takes the cake, excuse the pun. Look, I've got footage that we've been airing online today of this Hamas-themed birthday cake. You can see the black and white pattern of the Palestinian keffiyeh there, the Palestinian flag, and images of a Hamas terrorist on them. And the child himself that this was made for, a 4-year-old, is dressed as a Hamas terrorist at his own party in camouflage and wearing this red and white keffiyeh over his face. It's really quite sick, and the Western Sydney bakery who made this cake were gloating about it until they received some backlash online. They took their account down now, but Jewish groups are absolutely outraged by it. They say that it's a worrying sign that the indoctrination that we know has been happening of children overseas, grooming them to be terrorists. We see that happening in the Palestinian terrorists, that now we're now seeing evidence of that happening here. And I can tell you that the matter has now been referred to federal police, who are reviewing it to see whether any laws have been broken, but certainly really disturbing details to come out.
And you want to wonder where radicalised young people, radicalised teenagers come from. If you've got a 4-year-old dressed as a terrorist/suicide bomber, whatever that is there, on a Hamas birthday cake, it's shocking. Thank you, Caroline. Thank you, James. All right, after his weak comments yesterday that failed to refute any moral equivalence between the International Criminal Court's decision to seek to arrest the Israeli Prime Minister on one side, alongside, of course, the Hamas terror leadership on the other side, our Prime Minister today hid from the media. But not hiding was Peter Dutton, who said withdrawing from the court should be something Australia ought to consider. As did the man who supported Australia joining up in the first place, former Foreign Minister Alex Antic.
This is an outrageous decision. I think if the 4 or 5 judges decide to proceed with the prosecutor's recommendation, it will be the death of the International Criminal Court, and countries like Australia should just withdraw from it altogether.
And look, I have to say, as I've written for the Australian newspaper tomorrow, this issue is the final straw for me. Anthony Albanese is simply not up to being a national leader if he cannot take a position on a moral issue as fundamental as this. For his comment, I'm joined now by Foreign Editor for the Australian, Greg Sheridan. Well, we saw strength from Joe Biden. I don't normally use Joe Biden and the adjective strength in the one sentence, but he was very, very strong yesterday. There was statements from the Brits, the Germans, the Italians, the Austrians, Czechs, a whole lot, Greg. They all condemned the court's move. And our Prime Minister, though, wants to sit on the fence. As I said in my column tomorrow, this is the Emperor's got no clothes for me. It's that moment for me from here on in, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, Peter, great to be with you. If you can indulge me, I'll just take 1 second to pay a tribute to Nova Peris. There's no upside in this for her, but she's come out with decency, with common sense, with logic. I mean, there's leadership in the Labor Party from Nova Peris, but not from any of the current folks in Parliament. And one thing she said today, why can't we have protests on the street saying free the hostages and end the war? And, you know, that's an unanswerable question. Look, I think this is Albanese's worst moment as a Prime Minister. I got to tell you, I really like Albo as a person, you know, fellow Christian Brothers old boy, rugby league fanatic. I mean, he's got a lot of money in the bank with me, but I think this is, you know, just pathetic, just pathetic. The idea that you can't make a comment on an International Criminal Court case is absurd. We've often done it in the past. All of our allied governments are doing it. It's utterly pathetic to say you can't. Now, he ought to have the courage of his convictions. If he believes outrageously that a fellow ally, a fellow democracy, should be charged before the International Criminal Court for the crime of defending itself, and a country which has excellent independent legal procedures which will investigate any potential, you know, missteps or bad actions by any of its own players. So the International Criminal Court shouldn't be anywhere near it, and it has no jurisdiction anyway. There's no member state. Now, if he believes in the face of all that these warrants against the Israeli Prime Minister should be issued, well, he ought to have the guts to say so, and then we'll digest that horrible, bitter new element in our politics. And if he believes, like Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak and Justin Trudeau and all of our traditional allies and all of our own traditional positions, that this is at least a grotesque overreach by the International Criminal Court and possibly something much more sinister, then he ought to have the guts to say that. And for once in his life, stand up to the Greens and the Islamists who are making his life miserable as leader of the Labor Party. But the one thing he should not do is hide in a coward's castle behind a completely fraudulent and manufactured convention that you're not allowed to comment on the International Criminal Court, which frankly is such a silly proposition. I'm astonished that he's just not too embarrassed to put it out there in public.
Well, we have plenty of comments about Julian Assange. We speak out against World Trade Organisation cases. We talk about cases in international forum about the environment. We're always out there litigating international law and international institutions. You make a point in your column today that this says a lot about the toxic, obsessive, anti-Israel culture of the UN. You look at that UNGA vote, the UN General Assembly vote last week. This is basically upending, Greg, the settled international law that gives a nation state the right to self-defence. That's the takeout for me, that this is upending international law.
Yeah, you're right, Peter. So I opposed our signing the Rome Statute when we did, because I could see that it was going to be captured by the international UN bureaucracy and used only against nations like us. They come for Israel today, they'll come for us tomorrow on some trumped up nonsensical charge. And, Downer, I really admire Alexander Downer, but I mean, he's right to be ashamed of the fact that he championed signing this thing. Now, in the past, we have been able to reform really egregious and terrible excesses of the United Nations system. Now, this court is not technically part of the UN system, but it is in effect. It's governed by agreements with the UN and so on. We can't do it on our own. If a government decided to walk away from the ICC, they certainly would get support from me. But I'm not suggesting we do it on our own, but with like-minded nations. Now, the judges may refuse these warrants if there is sufficient political opposition. So here is another reason that Albanese's cowardice is so egregious, because the Americans have said they might subject ICC personnel who do this to sanctions. And if the judges in the ICC have one whit of common sense, they will deny these warrants and the ICC will survive. But if you're going to get a campaign to reform the ICC, or indeed to abolish it, which I think would be perfectly sensible, you're going to need a whole swag of like-minded countries to answer together. It would have to be under the leadership of the United States. I'm generally not an admirer of Joe Biden's presidency, but on this, he's as good as Ronald Reagan. I couldn't fault Biden for this.
I
and
agree.
Dutton,
I agree.
Who's done very well, was right to support him.
I couldn't agree more. Thank you, Greg. Thank you very much. Get to the Australian tomorrow. I tell you what, I do not miss, and I mean what I say. That is the turning point for me, Albanese. I mean, I was never going to vote Labor. Of course, I wasn't, but I respected him in the office of Prime Minister. He has lost my respect. No Prime Minister hides under the desk like that, sits on the fence like that. Shame on you, Prime Minister. All right, after the break, another diabolical UN move that we all need to understand before it's too late. This is that proposed pandemic treaty. Alex Antic after the break, plus more on Andrew Giles. He's got a history of going soft on detainees. We'll get to that. And those treaty negotiations in Victoria where only Indigenous members can run for particular seats in the Parliament, that's up for grabs. Welcome back. Well, we can't send those foreign criminals back to their home country, says the Minister. And it would appear we lack the backbone to lock them up as well. Just how at risk the community is from a Labor government that cares more about striking a pose and keeping you safe. James Patterson, we'll get into that in a moment. But first, I want to return to something that I touched on several weeks ago, and it's now reaching a crucial point. That's the World Health Organisation's pandemic treaty. Australia, along with 194 member states, are set to take part in the World Health Assembly, which kicks off on the 27th of May, so that's Monday. At the meeting, there will be a vote on two contentious yet widely underreported measures. They are amendments to the international health regulations and this proposed pandemic treaty. The irony is that we can't get a serious royal commission in this country into all those draconian COVID measures undertaken by our government, state and federal, but they're willing to sign us up to a new set of rules drawn up by a group of international bureaucrats. I can't believe that. Joining me now to discuss the detail, one of the few politicians who sounded the alarm, Liberal Senator for South Australia, Alex Antic. Alex, I've mentioned how underreported this is. It's not underreported if we look at your speeches in the Parliament, the media you have done. You have been indefatigable. You've managed to bring together a group of around 14 cross-party parliamentarians. You're trying to get the government not to sign us up to this treaty. Update us on that, but give us a sense of what your biggest concerns are here.
Yeah, well, thanks, Peter. And look, thank you for raising the alarm in the orbit of the mainstream media as well, because you're absolutely right. This has been entirely underreported. It seems the domestic mainstream media are fascinated by matters of relative trivia, while the big show is playing out above us at global level. So that is a very important thing. And I've been trying to do the same thing. It's a critical moment because what we're seeing now is effectively a globalist health power grab. I've been calling it a coup d'etat, and that is really what we are looking at here. This is the World Health Organization, which is a UN body under the guise of the World Health Assembly. Australia is one of those 194 member states that is proposing a brand new pandemic treaty. It's been called a number of things, but that's the general name, and 300 amendments to the international health regulations, which in short, and they are very complicated documents, but in short would give the Director General of the World Health Organization the ability to unilaterally declare an emergency, so a pandemic emergency, and fast-track pandemic-related products. And we know how that worked out last time. So this is, and that is the very tip of the iceberg, I must say. This is a very, very significant moment. Australia will ultimately have legal obligations at international law if this is to be ratified. But also there's a significant issue with respect to domestic law. When I was in Senate estimates 18 months, 2 years ago, I asked the Chief Medical Officer, Paul Kelly, why it was that Australians were being stopped from going overseas without 2 COVID injections. And the answer was the Biosecurity Act was amended in order to line us up with our obligations under the then international health regulations, the 2005 versions. And so you can see how, if this is ultimately ratified, there's no real limit to the obligations that will be put on the Australian Parliament to legislate to keep their obligations alive under that international health instrument. So this is a very, very significant moment. It needs to be more dealt with, and there need to be more politicians who are across it. I'm very thankful to the 14 who supported that letter to the Prime Minister, though.
We can see from the International Criminal Court example, and I remember that debate well in the Howard era. I was there, and there were plenty inside the Howard cabinet who did not want to sign Australia up to it. Trust us, it'll be fine. It will never have an impact on a democratic state. That's what they tell you. And of course, now we are 15 years on, and you can see what's happening here with Israel. What I think people need to understand with the process here, Alex, is that these pandemic laws have been drafted by international bureaucrats, all captured by the left. And we will send along to this assembly starting Monday a whole lot of our own bureaucrats. They will get this to the point that it will be signed by Australia, and it won't come into force until it gets rubber stamped through the Treaties Committee. There'll be no debate in the Australian Parliament. There'll be no questions asked of the Australian electorate. Do you want to give away your sovereignty like this? I think people need to understand, unlike the United States, where the treaty has to have a lot more political input, in Australia, we sign off on these things far too readily.
It's exactly right, Peter. And of course, what will happen if it's ratified, and those negotiations are underway, it will start next Monday, the actual voting period for the World Health Assembly. But what will happen is it will have to come through that treaty committee, which is dominated by the left. It'll then come to both houses of Parliament. And of course, that's the excuse that's always used. We're not giving away our sovereignty. The Australian Parliament is sovereign. But as you quite rightly pointed out in your article, those are rubber stamp jobs. These international treaties are always passed by the Parliament. And then it will become law. And this is what we talk about when these pandemics or other emergencies happen. We talk about this turnkey society. People turn around and say, I don't remember ever asking for mandates or for surveillance or for whatever the issue is. And before you know it, those powers have been bricked in. Well, this is what's happening. This is what will happen in the next occasion there is a pandemic or a global health crisis. We will find that we have afforded the international health bureaucrats the luxury of telling us what to do when local doctors get silenced and criticised. And that's what we saw with the ARPA regulations in the last period as well. So, of course, when we ask these questions in Parliament, during Senate estimates, we're told by health bureaucrats that it's all fine. Of course they'd say that because they're dealing with giving powers away to global health bureaucrats rather than local health bureaucrats. I mean, Australians do not want this, I can assure you. This has been a real sleeper issue. People are telling me in numbers I haven't seen for a long time that they are very worried about this. Prime Minister needs to pull out.
Keep the pressure up, please, Alex Antic. Keep the pressure up. It's incredibly important. Thank you for your time. I have to say, having lived through the Daniel Andrews experiment in Victoria, all those lockdowns for the 2.5 years, that makes this treaty would make Andrews seem like an absolute teddy bear. All right, let's go to that issue again, impacting Immigration Minister Andrew Giles. Joining me now, the Shadow Home Affairs Minister. By God, we wish he was in the job, James Patterson. Senator, thank you for your time. I think we've done a good job tonight explaining how the minister's direction plays into this, but surely now we've seen the AAT, the tribunal, basically use it as a fig leaf to allow an individual out of detention, that an individual allegedly has murdered another person. Surely the minister's now going to revoke this direction immediately.
Well, Peter, it never should have been issued in the first place. And if the minister believes, as he is now saying this afternoon, that the AAT has misinterpreted and therefore made a decision that was wrong in law, why didn't he appeal the decision of the AAT 2 months ago when it was made? And why didn't he use his discretion as minister to cancel this person's visa again and put them back into immigration detention and then force them to take the matter to the courts in order to get themselves freed? There is no way for Andrew Giles to escape responsibility here. He issued this direction. The effect of this direction has been put into practice by the AAT. A person has been freed and they've now allegedly murdered another person, as they threatened to do, and they should never have been in the community to do that. So there's nowhere for Andrew Giles to hide here.
Well, he is hiding. He has in front of the media. He's not taking questions. This is his modus operandi.
That's exactly right, Peter. Whenever the going gets tough, Andrew Giles disappears. The Minister of Home Affairs, Claire O'Neill, she disappears, and the Prime Minister tries to brush it off or focus on other things and has misdirections. Really, responsibility has to be taken here, because before this minister issued this direction, it was not a requirement for decision makers to consider the ties to a country before they made their decision. And in that direction, he specifically says considerable weight should be given to the fact that a non-citizen has been ordinarily resident in Australia during and since their formative years, regardless of when their offending commenced and the level of that offending. What that means, Peter, is no matter how serious the crimes they commit, a non-citizen shouldn't be deported from our country as long as they've been here since a kid. Now, this is designed to appease New Zealand, who've been complaining about this, but actually it applies to every person from every country who's here as a non-citizen.
James, my legal reading of that, though, the direction is it creates almost like a quasi-Australian status. You know, if you are here a long time, even though you are not Australian, you're not a permanent resident, you might be here, someone who was applying to be a refugee and rejected. You've got to put them in this this different category that just by dint of time in Australia, they get some of the rights of Australians. Now, that's not law. That's not in the Migration Act. If they're not Australians, they're not Australians.
I agree with you, Peter. It's got this bizarre situation now where we have Australian citizens who clearly can never be deported, people who are not citizens who came here recently who can be deported, and people in the middle who are not citizens but they've been here for a while, so we're going to go a bit lenient on them. I mean, there was no need to issue this direction. It can be repealed tomorrow if this government thinks that it's posed a danger to the community, as it clearly has, and it should be. There is just no excuse. If you commit a crime, I don't care how old you were when you came to this country. If you commit a crime, you're a non-citizen, you violated the agreement that you implicitly entered into when you came to our country by violating our laws and our values, and you should be kicked out. And I guarantee you, under a Dutton government, with me as Home Affairs Minister and with Dan Tehan as Immigration Minister, that's exactly what will happen.
Dave, just really quickly, the guy from Burundi who's broken curfew fronts the tribunal, or a magistrate in this case, and the magistrate makes a point where he lets him off, there's no incarceration that comes as a result, but he makes the point that the Commonwealth, yet again, the Commonwealth prosecutors offered no particular position on sentencing. Now, the last time this happened, there was a horrible consequence. The government said that they would lift their game, that they would give instructions to their lawyers. Again, this has happened.
That's right, Peter. And the Attorney-General has an opportunity here. The Attorney-General can issue a direction to prosecutors as to the approach he would like them to take in cases like these. And he could direct them to, for example, take the position that we shouldn't support bail, that we should always oppose bail in cases like these. Now, the General hasn't done so. The Prime Minister hasn't directed him to do so. So again, this government must take responsibility for the decisions of the courts. There will be people free in the community who should never have been in the community, who may now re-offend in the community, and that is on this government.
I swear to God, if you can't do the job, resign. This is what I'd say to ministers. If you can't do the job, resign. Go and get to another portfolio, or perhaps leave the parliament altogether. James, thank you. Gosh, it makes me angry. After the break, special seats in the parliament for Indigenous MPs only, and billions of dollars in reparations. The Victorian minister, which she's let the cat out of the bag. Plus, just how reliable is that CSIRO report? Everyone's jumping on it today about the coalition's nuclear plans. Welcome back. It's Wednesday. Still to come, of course. Kel Richards. Let's get into things with my panel. Shadow Environment Minister Jonathan Duniam and Senior Fellow at the Menzies Research Centre and a bit of a wandering energy expert, Nick Cater, coming to us again from overseas. Welcome to you both. I'll start, if I can, in Victoria, where the Allen government has refused to rule out reparations and Indigenous-only seats in the Parliament in the middle of these treaty negotiations. We saw that with the Minister on Tuesday, Natalie Hutchins, telling a hearing about the treaty process that absolutely everything is on the table. She also refused to answer questions on whether private land could be acquired by the government and handed over to Indigenous groups. Tom Elliott was asking Auntie Jill Gallagher, the former inaugural Treaty Advancement Commissioner, about all of this on 3AW this morning.
I think reparations should be on the table, and it might not be in the way of money for them. It might be in the way of empowerment, might be in the way of land, but definitely not private land, Tom. You know, I mean, no one is going to lose their private land.
And Nick, what I perhaps am the most angry about is the option of seats in the Parliament being reserved for people based on race. Yeah. They call this apartheid in other countries, but the left here want to pretend it's some sort of reconciliation or progress. I mean, this is appalling.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing I'd say is I thought that the Allen government was very driven by the polls. We had a very reliable poll on this last year on October the 14th. We all know what the result of that was, 60-40. So, you know, they should listen to what people were saying, and people were not speaking about just a narrow particular constitutional change. They were talking about the whole idea that we should treat some Australian citizens differently on the basis of race or ancestry. That's just not part of the Australian way. So I think most Australians, vast majority of Australians, I'm very confident will be as appalled as you and I are with the idea of reparations, from who to whom and why. But definitely, I'm with you on this, Peter. I think the idea we should set aside seats in Parliament based on race. You know, this is something that I used to report on 30 years ago from Malaysia, and we thought it was appalling. It's not part of the Australian way, and it should be off the table. And the sooner Premier Allen puts this off the agenda, the better it'll be.
And it has to be killed off in Victoria, because I mean this, what happens in Victoria, it's like a cancer in other Labor states, and it'll go right around the country, and it'll be basically the voice by stealth. It'll be treaty by stealth, and then it'll push its way back into Canberra. The Republican movement suffered a pretty big blow today. The co-chair, Nova Peris, she resigned, and this is due to comments made by the other co-chair, Craig Foster, on Israel. This is extraordinary. I can't say I'm not unhappy. I have no truck with the Republican cause, Senator Duniam, but Nova Peris, Greg Sheridan made the comment before, very brave for this move. I have to say I also commend her.
Yeah, I'm with you in commending Nova Peris for what she's done. No, I consider her to be a very thought-through individual, someone who doesn't make rash decisions. Craig Foster seems to be an individual who will find any passing bandwagon of the left's cause and jump on it, whether it is the matter relating to the Israel-Gaza conflict or the failed voice referendum or indeed the Republican movement. He will be attached to it. Now, is this a good or a bad thing for the Republican referendum? Well, given he attached himself so heavily to the voice referendum, perhaps it's a good thing for them. But at the end of the day, frankly, he, a great soccer player, should stick to his knitting and perhaps encourage young people to get out and get fit and get off their devices and stop meddling in politics.
Sage advice. Let's go to nuclear energy if we can. There's a report out today, Gen Cost. This is from the CSIRO estimates, CSIRO. They're saying that a large-scale nuclear reactor in Australia could cost something like $17 billion. They make that sound very scary. But let's not forget, Nick Cater, Snowy 2.0, that just got revised up in the budget a couple of weeks ago. That's going to cost us $12 billion. Now, I don't believe it's 12. It'll be more by the time we actually see it. If we can get Snowy, which is basically water going around like a battery, or a large-scale nuclear reactor for about the same money, I know where I want to go. I want to go nuclear.
That's right. As I told you last week, I was in Finland. I went to the Olkiluoto 3 reactor, which was completed last year, state-of-the-art, third-generation pressurised water reactor, cost them 9.6 billion Australian for 1.6 gigawatts. That's a bargain. Now, even if we had to pay more than that, and we probably would because of inflation and costs in one way or another, but we know the technology is there, we know it works. Sweden, right, 40% nuclear. They were going to close down some of their nuclear plants, the previous government. The new government came in and said, no, we're not going to do it. They're keeping their nuclear open and they're looking for more. And that's in a country which has got abundant hydroelectricity. They're sensible. That's why electricity is cheaper in Sweden than it is in Germany right now, and why their industry is not going overseas in the way that German industry is going. I just think it's a no-brainer, Peter. I really do.
So do I. And lest our industries go overseas, we've got to get serious about it. John, we know that there's a deal soon to be announced about extending the life of Eraring. They wanted to close it. They've worked out they actually need coal to keep the lights on in New South Wales. But what's tied up in this is the reports today, there's about 1,000 coal miners worried that they could lose their job if Eraring's operator, Origin, doesn't renew its contract with Centennial Coal. Two Centennial mines supply the station with its coal. This makes me run with that refrain. You know, where are all the green jobs now? We're told renewables are cheap. Well, they're not cheap. We're told that everyone will just migrate to a green job. Where's the green jobs for the coal miners now?
The green jobs happen to be a myth, Peter. They're not coming. I hate to tell the people of the Hunter that they've been sold a porky on this one and the rest of Australia. They're not coming. The transition isn't going the way Anthony Albanese promised it would. And those 1,000 jobs, those 1,000 households whose livelihoods depend on coal-fired energy generation, well, those jobs are in jeopardy because their local member who says, as I read today in the media, hasn't got much he can say about this at this point. He should be standing up for their jobs. Everyone knows that we need reliable baseload generation, including coal, to keep the lights on. We haven't got this green transition under control that Labor promised we'd have. Those jobs are in question because they have not got this sorted out, and it is up to them to fix this. Right. Green jobs aren't coming. Secure the coal jobs today.
Thank you, gents. I must say, and I'm allowed to say it, I don't care if I upset the sexist people watching the show, but you look fabulous. I love to see a man in a tie. You look pretty snappy in that three-piece suit too down in Tasmania, Jono. See you both next week. Can you believe that there's a Lego room, a puzzles room for anyone who's in the Department of Agriculture? Farmers are busting a gut out in the paddock, and these guys in Canberra who represent farmers, they're playing with their Lego. All right, after the break, Kel Richards. Welcome back. Joining me now, Kel Richards. Hey, Kel, a bit of punctuation, not pronunciation, to kick us off. Oxford comma. Paul, one of our viewers, wants to know what's meant by the Oxford comma.
The question is, if you've got a list of things, how many commas should there be in the list? For example, should you go A, comma, B, comma, C, comma, and D? Or do you drop the last comma, A, comma, B, comma, C, and D? Now, most grammars say drop the last comma, the one before the and, but the Oxford University Press insists in its style guide you put in every comma after every item in the list. Now, I like the idea. I think the more commas, the more clarity. This is, as far as I'm concerned, the age of the comma man. So let's put them in, it's clearer.
You know, we must be so boring because this would be something that I would have an argument about with people for a good hour about whether to put it in or out. I used to put the Oxford comma in. Then I sometimes think it looks too busy in my sentence and I take it out. But anyway, hey, Faye from Perth wants to know, where does the gift of the gab come from?
Gab came into English from a Scottish word meaning the mouth, so it's the gift of having a glib mouth, fairly obviously. Closely related to our common slang word for a mouth, which is a gob. So gab, gob, and that whole family of words, gab, gob, originally meaning a fanciful speech, appears to go all the way back to Anglo-Norman and Middle French. So they gave us these odd words for speech. They came in to mean mouth, and that's what they mean now.
All right, well, Judith from Sunshine Beach wants to know about a bit of a favourite of mine. My dad used to use it all the time. I quite love a bit of a bugger-lug. Where does bugger-lug come from?
Been around since 1861. It was originally someone who was very irritating. It's like, being bugged by something, because bugs, insects, irritate us. Flies and insects irritate us. So if you bug someone, you're irritating them. So a buggerlugs was originally someone irritating, but it got softer over the years. It became a term of affection. So you call a small child, hey, buggerlugs. So it's one of those words which has gone from being annoying to being gentle.
I call my husband Peanut too, and that's a term of affection. I don't mean it in a pejorative sense. Call him other things too, but I'll leave those off TV. All right, Kel, see you next week. Thanks a lot. All right, that's it for me. Up next, Andrew Bolt.